So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today, and I definitely do want to come back on May 24th to hear about legislation and activism in archaeology. Um, so that sounds awesome. I'm super excited for that. But today I am here to talk to you mostly about my SHA paper, but this is kind of an adapted version for y'all. We've got the title here, Mississippi Street was eaten by the sea, climate justice and coastal heritage in Liberia. And this was not necessarily co-authored, but co-performed the work with the co-director of my project, Prince Condé, and another researcher that we've worked with named Chris Morris. So I'd be remiss if I didn't give them the full credit for this project. So I am a PhD candidate in the nautical archaeology program at Texas A&M in the Department of Anthropology. I'm in my fourth year, or finishing my fourth year now. I'll probably graduate next year. I plan to defend in February. So you're getting me at a really good time where I really know where things are heading and kind of the avenues that we're pursuing. So if you have other questions about our work in Liberia, I'm more than happy to answer them. But today I'm here to talk to you about climate change and coastal heritage at risk in Liberia. So I have some areas where I'm going to be reading segments of stories from my paper and other areas where I'm just going to be talking at you. And if you have any questions, the chat will pop up on my screen so I can see them, or you can unmute yourself in the middle of when I'm talking. I'm a lecturer as well, so I'm quite used to people asking questions in the middle of things. So I'm more than happy to do that as well. So there we go. Let's fast forward. So this is one of the parts I'm going to read to you because it contains direct quotes from Chris Morris, who said, "Mississippi Street was eaten by the sea a few years ago. When I asked if it was during our own lifetimes, because Chris and I are the same age, he recounted how, as a child born in the 90s, he remembered Mississippi Street in downtown Greenville, Sino County, Liberia, and the lavish mansions that stood there, homes of the descendants of formerly enslaved African Americans who had settled the area in the 19th century. Today, the entire street and the ruins of the mansions that once lined it are completely submerged in the Atlantic Ocean, more than 10 meters from the shoreline. For those of you unfamiliar with Liberia's history, which is most of my audiences nowadays, you might be wondering how formerly enslaved African Americans ended up in this small West African nation and what its significance is for maritime history. For the first part, I would point you to some other archaeologists doing work in Liberia, the Back to Africa Heritage and Archaeology Project. And for the second part on maritime heritage, I today would like to invite you to consider Liberia as a case study of the impacts of climate change on maritime cultural heritage in the global South. Liberia is a very small country in West Africa with a population of a little over 5 million. When I speak to my students about Liberia, I like to overlay Liberia over Texas, and you can see it's like the size of the distance from basically Dallas to Houston. So it's a pretty small country compared to some of the states in the US, but historically Liberia has been very important for Atlantic trade. So the reason I'm talking to you about climate today is because specifically related to maritime heritage, climate change directly affects anything on the coast or underwater. Climate scientists estimate that by the end of 2030, which is the end of the UN ocean decade, sea level rise across the globe will have risen by over 30 millimeters. But the effects of this sea level rise and the destruction it causes are felt most by the global majority in the areas of Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. However, most of those nations are not the ones causing the emissions and the climate effects that cause sea level rise. And what I'm here to argue today is that the effects of this sea level rise are mostly caused by a lack of responsible policies from the world's wealthiest nations like the US, Canada, the UK, China. Thus, this paper is an urgent call to action for climate justice, including coastal archaeology and heritage. I'm going to show you some photos from Liberia throughout this presentation. Any of the photos that have people in them are shared with permission, and Prince Condé and Chris Morris significantly contributed to this work, so I would like to give them the full credit for that. All right, so moving forward to this map of Liberia where you see this red balloon, that is the city of Greenville, which is where I conduct my dissertation research. Greenville is a small town in southeastern Liberia in a county called Sino County. It's about 300 miles from the capital city of Monrovia. And as of the 2008 census, which was the last analyzed census data in Liberia, Greenville had a population of 16,000. Most of these people come from the Kru and Grebo ethnic groups, which are two of Liberia's 16 indigenous groups. Greenville itself was established on a river inlet in Sino County in 1838 by African-American settlers from the town of Greenville, Mississippi. So when you Google Greenville, your first results are like South Carolina, Mississippi, because Greenville, Liberia was named after Greenville, Mississippi. The people who migrated there in 1838 were basically forced to migrate to Liberia after their enslaver on the plantation they had been enslaved was not killed, but he died of natural causes in 1836. And his will decreed that his plantation, called Prospect Hill, would be sold, and then the enslaved people who had been, living and working there would be basically forced to move to Liberia if they wanted their freedom. And the proceeds from the sale of the plantation would finance their transport to Liberia. So this was especially common during the 19th century, during the Back to Africa movement, which saw many freed African Americans travel to Liberia, both through coercion, like the Greenville settlers, but also through their own decision and their own search for freedom. You also had Caribbean Africans come, as well as African Americans from the US. Upon arrival, the settlers faced a lot of difficulty because they were not used to this climate. There were indigenous Liberians already living there, and there was also basic necessities of survival. Eventually, the settlers in Greenville pulled through, and they were pretty active in maritime trade along the coast. Liberia was always an important stop for ships in the Atlantic trade because it's right at the southernmost point of West Africa. And then during the area of legitimate trade, after the slave trade was abolished, Liberia was and still is a major exporter of palm oil and rubber. So a lot of the sites related to this maritime activity and trade are now submerged, just like Mississippi Street, which is pictured here in this photo in 1926. So this street that you see pictured here is now completely submerged. So here's another couple of images of Greenville. You can see the image at the top is one of the original settlers' artworks, and it shows that settlement on sort of the left bank of the Sino River, which is kind of cutting through Greenville here. So you see the settlers area on the left bank, and then you can see indigenous towns on both sides as well, symbolized by those pointy roofed structures. The resolution is really bad, but you can see those pointy roof structures. You can kind of compare this with the topography of the aerial image that I took in 2023 on the bottom. So the aerial image was taken during the rainy season, but even not during the rainy season, there is still a heck of a lot more water in the mouth of the Sino River nowadays than there was back then, at least according to this watercolor. The Sino seems to have a very small sort of protected river mouth in the period of settlement, and now the river mouth is quite large, mostly as a result of dredging for the port of Greenville, which you can see depicted on the bottom right. The port of Greenville has existed as long as the settlers were there, but in more recent years, it has been dredged out so that cargo ships from a Malaysian palm oil company called Golden Verolium Liberia, or GVL, can enter the port. And nowadays, those are the only cargo ships entering the port of Greenville, and they come about every 2 months or so. So by using sources like these, historical images, photographs, and then on-the-ground survey, we can see firsthand some of these impacts of catastrophic climate change on areas that might be important for coastal heritage. Across Liberia, including in Sino County, where Greenville is, there are several major threats to coastal heritage, and I'm going to go through each of them, including rising sea levels, shoreline erosion, extreme weather events, and then global erasure of this history. So to start with sea level rise, sea level rise is often the first thing people think or talk about when they discuss climate impacts on maritime or underwater cultural heritage, right? Sea level rise is one of those big, important aspects. For those of you in Florida, you may hear that, Florida is going to be underwater in several years. So sea level rise is a very important impact to discuss. These photos that I'm showing you here show the end of current Mississippi Street on the left-hand side, and then a historical image of the same exact location on the right-hand side. So you can tell that these are the same image from the same place because of that giant cottonwood tree that you can see sort of sticking up on the other bank of the river. Cottonwood trees have a really long lifespan. They're used as navigation aids. And so this is the same cottonwood tree as the image nowadays that I took, and then the image from the 1920s, same cottonwood tree there. But you can see that the distance of that shoreline is completely different nowadays than it was in the 1920s. The distance of that shoreline with the cottonwood tree nowadays in the picture on the left is so far away compared to the 1920s image of this boat launching. So this I used as an emblem of sea level rise because what you're seeing in that left-hand picture is actually the ruins of one of those houses on Mississippi Street. If I can get my image to go, come on, there we go. So this is the ruins of one of those houses on Mississippi Street. You can see sort of the outer wall here, and then these are right in the middle of the image. There are actually stairs that are completely submerged. So those are like the front stairs to the first floor of the house. It's completely filled in with like silted sand now. And when high tide comes, it's completely covered over. But this is one of those old houses that used to stand on Mississippi Street. So this is emblematic of a lot of climate impacts, right? But especially sea level rise. And in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions that drive sea level rise, Liberia is responsible. They give you some interesting statistics. Liberia is responsible for a total of 0.2 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per capita, placing it in the bottom 2% of nations, according to the World Bank and International Climate Change Portal. I think Liberia was actually in the bottom 10 producers of per capita carbon emissions. Comparatively, the US, the UK, and Qatar produce around 16, 6, and 39 metric tons of carbon dioxide per capita, respectively. 27 of the lowest 30 on this list of nations are African nations. So out of the bottom 30 emissions producing nations, there are 27 in Africa. Despite this, the blunt of the climate crisis is felt most among coastal populations in the world's poorest cities, which are mostly in Africa. In all projected cases of sea level rise, whether it's the lowest at 0.5 meters or the highest at 6 meters in the next 100 years, all of these areas in West Africa will be drastically affected. As you can see in this area in Liberia, which was once a large house, it's completely submerged, and tidal changes carry sediment that have filled in the footprint of the house. In terms of archaeological excavation, those of you who may have worked in a dynamic intertidal zone know the difficulties of any type of logistics of excavation in an area like this, and the frustration of having your work undone every day by the tide. This is part of why we are not excavating or looking at this area. So one of the other major impacts in Liberia is coastal erosion, which goes hand in hand with sea level rise. Coastal erosion in Liberia has actually become such a big issue that the outgoing president, George Weah, actually ran on a platform of stopping coastal erosion. Like that was part of his massive party platform, was to stop coastal erosion through the construction of these rock seawalls in major port cities. So you can see that in the largest picture here, some of those rocks that were placed on the shoreline of Greenville during Weah's presidency. However, his administration largely failed to execute this promise, and that's actually one of the reasons, among a whole bunch of others, that he was not reelected. According to the International Hydrographic Organization, causes of coastal erosion in Liberia are attributed mostly to longshore drift and sand mining. But things like riverine sediment deposit also contributes to dynamic changes on the shoreline. But most of the human impacts here come from sand mining and longshore drift. Of course, these are not necessarily new environmental impacts, but the focus is on Liberia as an archaeologically significant place and as a country warranting maritime archaeological study, which is a new focus. You can also see in some of these images, the two smaller images show houses from Mississippi Street, from the very edge of Mississippi Street, that are now completely destroyed from that erosion of the coastline. So this is another major impact in Liberia that goes hand in hand with sea level rise. I wanted to pull out these satellite imagery from 2017 on the left and 2023 on the right. So you can see the effects of dredging for the port of Greenville and the harbor. And so you can see in some ways that this is also a very dynamic river estuary. And human action does not necessarily change that fact, but it definitely makes it worse. So some of these topographical changes are to be expected at river mouths, but others are exacerbated by dredging, and especially the loss of significant coastline outside the river mouth. So you can see towards like the top extremities and the bottom extremities of either image that you're also losing a lot of coastline there in areas that are not being dredged for the port. These climate,
Megan, I'm
yes,
sorry, Megan.
no, you're fine.
What were what's the date again on the one on the left?
The left is 2017, the right is 2022. So what is that, a 5-year period?
17. Oh my God.
Yeah, so over a 5-year period, you can see the complete loss of that strip of land at the end of where Greenville is, and then it's completely taken over by the river mouth by 2022. So and again, this is a very dynamic river mouth, so not all of this is the result of human action, but it's definitely exacerbated by that because the port of Greenville is constantly being dredged out. Sand is always being mined upriver, and so the sand being mined upriver contributes to the river swelling more easily. The river swells more easily and washes out things towards the river mouth. So it's all connected, which is something I've been learning more and more about climate change and all of these things, is that all of these impacts are connected, even if they seem very far away from each other. And one of the things they're connected by is sort of structural inequalities on a world scale. And so Liberia has a very complicated history with colonial extraction, and I'm not really going to get into that here, but exploitation of Liberian resources and people continues to this day and is one of the reasons for these climate impacts that has stark ecological consequences. So that dredging for the port of Greenville is carried out by Golden Verolium, which is a Malaysian palm oil company. So Kimberly's saying sand, yeah, sand is exported for industrial processes. A lot of the sand mining is black sand, which is used, I think, for titanium or something. Most of those companies are not Liberian owned. They are owned by foreign interests. And most of these profits are never seen by Liberians. So a lot of the sand mining for black sand is mostly by Chinese companies with very little benefit seen by Liberian citizens. That being said, Liberian citizens are keenly aware of the impacts that stuff like this has on their natural resources and on their livelihoods. And many of them have expressed that they feel powerless to stop these kinds of things unless their government gets directly involved. So I'm going to show you another very striking image next. This is one of those houses from Mississippi Street falling into the sea. Scientists project that more than 2,100 square kilometers of Liberia's coastline will be completely submerged by the end of this projected sea level rise projections. So this is going to put millions of people at a risk from extreme weather events, coastal erosion, sanitation issues, loss of housing, loss of agricultural land, and other environmentally based social issues by the end of this century. The disappearance of Mississippi Street into the sea is evidence of what people in this area have long seen coming. The coast has always been dynamic. It's always been affected by human action, but anthropogenic climate change has drastically increased this. One of the things people are seeing more often is storm surges and extreme weather events that lead to flooding, inundation, as we're seeing right now in Kenya, where huge swaths of Nairobi, the capital city in East Africa, are being affected by storm surges. Huge swaths of area in Nigeria, in West Africa, are also being affected by flooding. This site in Greenville that's pictured here is at the very end of the remains of Mississippi Street now. It used to be a 3-story settler's home. It was then converted to a church. It was then converted to a bar and nightclub, and then back to a church. In 2007, this spot flooded during an extreme weather event. Right now, it's a little bit far from the sea. You can kind of see the distance between the ocean and the house nowadays, but during extreme weather events, this house was repeatedly flooded. And it happened every year from 2007 to 2017 when the house was abandoned. According to Prince Conde, our project co-director, the sea has come about 20 meters closer than it was when he was a child in the early 2000s. And storm surges are a massive cause of destruction of coastal properties and coastal sites. I want to play a video for you where Prince is firsthand showing the effects of sea level rise. I think shared my audio, but please interrupt if you cannot hear the next video slide.
Hello everyone, my name is Prince D. Conde from West Africa, Liberia, to be specific, Greenville City, Central County. I'm live from the Mississippi Street in Greenville, Central County. I work with the Innovative Education Liberia, IEL, and I'm an online student of the University of Indiana, Wesleyan, in Indiana State, the United States of America.
Okay, that was Prince's introduction, and the next video he's giving a tour kind of the area at the very end of Mississippi Street. And in this video, you can really firsthand see some of the destruction that things like sea level rise, coastal erosion, and storm surges have really wrought on this area.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in Greenville, Central County. Where I am is the Mississippi Street, the main street that leads from Johnston Street straight to where we call downtown in Greenville, Central County. This is where we used to be, and this was the main street of Greenville, but the street has been eaten up by the sea. And back in the days, we used to have a football field somewhere there, but everything is now into the sea. The wave from the sea is eating all the main street, and we have no solution to it right now. We are thinking how best to see that this erosion from the sea, the wave from the sea, stop, because almost the whole community of downtown now is being undermined by the ocean. So we are here today. As you can see, these are all quotas of the main street, which is the Mississippi Street in Africa now, which is Mississippi in Sino. We have here, you can see, the sea has eaten up the whole of Mississippi Street, and we have engaged the government several times concerning the danger that this ocean is causing to us as citizens, but they continue telling us that they don't have the funds to stop the sea, to stop the ocean. So this is another part of this ocean. This is where the main street, and the street is damaged now. You can see we used to have this street from here all the way downtown where we call the Congo settlement. And we also have something here. This is the main street that connects Greenville. So yeah, thank you so much.
So I think that video really illustrates, and I hope you could hear it okay.
Sounded great.
Really illustrates some of the infrastructure destruction that happens here as well. Especially in a nation like Liberia that is rebuilding after decades of a brutal civil war in the late 90s, still rebuilding their infrastructure. They don't need sea level rise and correcting things on top of that, but it is. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to hear from Prince. That's the same video I played over at the SHA. So it is back from January, but I mean, things have not changed. You also see a lot of plastic pollution on the beach there. Some of that is generated by, Liberians themselves, and some of it does wash up from the ocean. So there's no real way to tell like which is which in a video like this, but plastic pollution is also a huge issue that a lot of our oceans are facing. So that's a bonus climate impact that I hadn't intended to discuss previously. All right, there we go. So the last impact I really want to talk about is the impact on intangible heritage that climate change has. So we've talked about some very tangible impacts on physical heritage, buildings, things like that. But climate change and anthropogenic climate change also has a huge impact on intangible heritage, such as fishing. So these forms of intangible heritage are also at a massive risk from sea level rise, erosion, and other, especially plastic pollution as well. So heritage practitioners must present solutions to this crisis in partnership with communities that are currently working against climate change. So for example, artisanal fishers in Liberia, like this group pictured in Greenville, are incredibly politically active in their own government, and they're attempting to get more involved in the international community in urging bans against illegal fisheries and trawling by large international corporations. Actually, if you go on Facebook right now and you look at the Liberian Artisanal Fishermen's Association, you'll see they've done a whole social media series the last week about anti-trawling activism. And so in Sino County, this is especially evident, the impacts that actions like trawling and overfishing have on the livelihoods of everyday fishermen. Overfishing, trawling, ecologically devastating commercial fishing practices, these all place artisanal fishers at a disadvantage. The daily catch is already lessening for a lot of fishing communities that depend on these fish for sustenance and their livelihoods. And the traditional fishing practices that occur in dugout canoes like this one here are important intangible aspects of heritage that deserve protection and investment. And a lot of loss of livelihoods and living places as a result of coastal climate change affects these fishermen, as they can no longer live in the same coastal areas that they've been living for generations. This also leads to a lot of irregular maritime migration, especially from other areas of West Africa like Senegal, where artisanal fishermen are drastically losing livelihoods. So artisanal fishers in Liberia especially have been incredibly politically active in urging their government to fight a lot of this corruption and negative ecological consequences. And so this should be of great significance to archaeologists and heritage practitioners working in these maritime areas and working alongside communities that are affected by these ecological impacts. This photo is from the Red Hill fishing community in Greenville, and that's their chairman, Frank, in the yellow shirt there, who had just come in from his fishing catch of the day. So this is shared with his permission. If you're friends with me on Facebook, sometimes he posts like weird things on my Facebook wall that are like sermons from Liberian pastors. So you might you might see those come up if you're friends with me on Facebook. Frank Doe is also my friend on Facebook. So that's kind of cool. So I wanted to also propose some solutions geared towards policymakers and maritime archaeologists instead of just identifying these climate impacts. So the first solution I wanted to propose is that policymakers should be cognizant of maritime heritage of areas like Liberia that are post-colonial, racialized areas of the global South. And policymakers in the global North must be willing to implement solutions that are in conversation and imagined by communities in these areas. So whether this means new archaeology projects, new heritage projects, new anti-trawling initiatives like that of the Liberian Association, all of these things are steps forward to bringing global awareness of this issue. Our project, Prince and I co-direct a new project in Sino County that we developed last year, and we're trying to document for the first time Indigenous maritime heritage in the Sino County alongside local communities. We're using a lot of archival and historical documents, maps, oral histories, and we've already identified at least 5 major maritime heritage sites in that coastal zone of Sino County that have never been studied archaeologically. As our project progresses, we really hope to lay the groundwork for a sustained program of maritime archaeology in Liberia, and we have some exciting results from our preliminary activity, and we're also preparing again for another field season this summer. I can proudly say our work is already having an impact through Prince's education activity and through our partnership with communities like the fishermen depicted in the last slide. And by conducting systematic study of the material culture and landscape change of Sino County, we're contributing to preserving this heritage for the future and ensuring that control of the heritage stays in the hands of local communities. So archaeological efforts pioneered by projects like the Back to Africa Heritage and Archaeology Project and like our new initiative is trying to do are contributing to advancing those sustainable development goals regarding ocean health. Secondly, we urge that maritime heritage must look beyond the water. So when we talk about maritime and underwater archaeology, we're not just looking underwater. In fact, our project occurs exclusively on land and even beyond the coastline. So when we discuss UCH, we're often talking about submerged heritage, but coastal heritage also stands to lose significantly as a result of climate change. So we have to start imagining solutions for heritage that is soon going to turn into underwater cultural heritage, but is currently terrestrial. So we have to imagine those solutions in advance. Surely prior to 20 or 30 years ago, no one could have imagined Mississippi Street being way out here where the sunset is in the ocean. But the fact is that it is now. What could have been different if heritage practitioners had been cognizant of this fact or had taken steps to preserve this area or to document it and record it before it was submerged? Documentation and recording are vital to this effort. Salvage archaeology is vital to our climate response. And even more, as someone engaged in activist archaeology, activism for environmental policies and environmental justice in our own nations should be paramount to those of us working in other areas. Nations in the global south, like Liberia, are not responsible for the emissions that are causing their sea level rise, but my own nation, the US, is. And so I need to urge my politicians and my country to take more action to curb our carbon emissions that have been almost entirely responsible for drastic sea level rise. We must hold large corporations, celebrities, and manufacturers responsible for their climate effects because most of those come out of our nations, not those in the global south. And during the ocean decade, that's sort of the message I want to leave archaeologists with. I believe we have a responsibility not just to study the past or preserve the past, but to advocate for policies that benefit the global community, to advocate for policies that help preserve and protect heritage, like those that you'll discuss later on in May that I'm super excited to hear about. I'm going to leave you with this striking image at the end as I talk about advocating for these policies. As archaeologists, we can all do more in this regard, especially those of us who pair archaeology and activism, who work with communities, or who work in the maritime domain. Maritime archaeologists are especially cognizant of the oceanic impacts of climate change. This advocacy is part of climate justice and indeed is a form of reparations for nations like Liberia that are healing from years of colonization and conflict through their heritage and history. And as we get to protect and preserve that, we get to see that healing happen in real time. That is the end of my presentation. If you're interested in some of those Liberia-specific sources, you can see some of those here. My acknowledgements here, as well as funding acknowledgements from the A&M Department of Anthropology. This work was just funded by the Department of Anthropology, but I later received grants from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology, which must be credited in this video. I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who's helped this happen, especially to Prince Condé and Chris Morris. So I have plenty of time for questions. I know that was a lot longer than my SHA presentation, but I wanted to really get into the details of it.